Can you guys hear me? All right. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Breaking the Ice. My name is Amanda. I'm the historian of SMAD. I'd like to start with the SMAD mission statement. The Society of Multicultural Architects and Designers were founded in February 2003 at Syracuse University. SMAD was created in order to supplement the academic curriculum with multicultural pedagogues, in all spatial design majors with an emphasis on architecture. In doing so, we intended on bridging the gap between these various design majors. SMAD also addressed the issue of administration and retention of students of multicultural ethnicities in design majors by assisting the School of Architecture with programs to increase admissions of multicultural students, as well as supply a student support system that will assist in all students in their academic advising. SMAD has served as a peer social group, as well as provide academic support and served as a relationship between underrepresented students and university administration and faculty. Our organization is creating events and programs to inform the community of the issues in our field that are reflecting the movement taking place on a larger scale. The different programs that we provide are mentoring. Through the mentoring program, mentors and mentorees have come together in common interests and make the two work together well. We also promote different possibilities to start to understand different cultures through posters and events and food gatherings. Last year, an event of ours was lunch with the visiting architect, Mijin Yoon, where we had like a talk and answering questions. We also started diversity and design posters where students who wanted to educate others go in depth on different types of culture in architecture and design. We also hosted the recent CBT weekend here at Slocum, where alumni of different stature came to School of Architecture, came to see us and have a good time with us. We also had an event called Culture Shock just recently, where we brought different foods from different backgrounds to one place to bring people together and to talk about the different types of foods and types of cultures that there is. Through that, we also have the SMAD week going on that's coming to an end soon. But we hope to keep these programs with new programs and also promoting these issues through the future generations of SMAD. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jonathan Leon, and on behalf of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, Delta Zeta Chapter here at Syracuse University, I want to thank you guys for coming out to show your support. Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated was founded on a Tuesday, December 4th, 1906, at Cornell University, Ithaca, New York, by 7 jewels that we call. Their names are Henry Arthur Callis, Charles Henry Chapman, Eugene Kinkle Jones, George Whittle Kelly, Nathaniel Allison Murray, and Vernon Woodson Tandy. Vernon Woodson Tandy being the first African-American registered architect in the state of New York. We've been at Syracuse University as a Delta Zeta chapter since 1949, but Alpha has been on Syracuse's campus since 1910. We're going to celebrate 100 years next year. Once again, I'd like to thank you guys for coming out. We really appreciate the support, and have a good night.
Hello. Hi, I'm Danielle Segovia Burke, and I'm the current president of the Society of Multicultural Architects and Designers. This lecture series that SMAD and Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated are sponsoring together is intended to showcase the prowess of a young architecture firm that represents or caters to the underrepresented in the field. This year, we invited Studio SUMO for their innovation in the field of architecture and their attention to detail and culture in their portfolio. Studio SUMO is a Long Island City architecture firm founded by Yolande Daniels and Sunil Ball in 1995. Since 1995, SUMO has received recognition from the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Young Architects Program of the Museum of Modern Art, and the Architectural League of New York. Additionally, they were honored with the Architectural Records Design Vanguard in 2006, featured in many publications within our discipline. Yolande Daniels received her BS of Architecture from City College and her MArch from Columbia University, where she is currently an assistant professor. Ms. Daniels also is a fellow of the MacDowell Colony, the American Academy in Rome, and the Whitney Museum of American Art Independent Study Program. Sunil Ball received his Bachelor of Arts in Biology from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a Master's of Architecture from Columbia, where he was awarded the AIA Medal on graduation. Mr. Bald was also awarded a Fulbright Fellowship, a Graham Foundation grant, and a fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts. He has also taught at Cornell University, the University of Michigan, and Columbia. He is presently on the faculty of Parsons School of Design and the Yale School of Architecture. Studio SUMO's recent architectural projects include the Business School in Japan, Museum of Contemporary African Display and Art in Brooklyn, New York, the Museum for African Art in New York, Mini-Max Prefabricated Housing Prototype, Urban Life Exhibition Design, Urban Center, New York City, the Intimate Landscapes installation, Project Row Houses in Houston, and the Milan House in Little Haiti community of Miami. Studio SUMO is a firm to watch with over 10 successful years in the field, getting many accolades for their design work and being a pioneer as a multicultural partnered firm. I now present to you Yolande Daniels and Sunil Ball, Studio SUMO.
Can you hear? Testing? Yeah? Okay.
I don't know where it went.
Oh, here. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle.
I'm sure our parents would finally like to hear those words I pronounce.
No. Anyway, thanks. Thank you to the Society of Multicultural Architects and Designers and Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, and to Danielle and Taya, who walked us around and shepherded us here, Scott Ruff and Dean Robbins. We're really happy to be presenting our work to you today. And it's nice to do it in this context. So we actually, in addressing the context that we were invited here, we thought we'd talk about our work through the issue of context and in 3 different ways. So we'll show you a series of projects, and they cover a range of production that kind of ranges in scale from very small kind of installation projects, the size of a box even, to a building. Right, and these are the projects. All right, so the first few projects, when we were trying to think about how we would talk about our work, what is it that we actually do. A series of the projects actually fall under the idea of a prototype or like objects. And so this project, Flip Flop, was in Alphabet City in New York, or the Lower East Side. And it was one of our first projects. It was 300 square feet. The idea of the project was that it was a live-work space. And basically everything in it had to fold down and fold up so that there would be space to work within. And we approached the project as a series of masks, so that when parts came down, some parts of the space might be screened. It was a storefront that came right off the street, and so if you opened the door, you could look immediately in. We've described it as a space without qualities. It didn't have much light. It had been a former crack house, actually. And so it was really cheap, and it was perfect for us. And we basically, just kind of did all the details ourselves. We worked with a fabricator in Ithaca at the time to make the pieces, and it's very rough and kind of inexpensive. Some things we just kind of got off the streets. And the project, I'll talk to you about this one, but Sunil will show another one which is kind of similar, but in that one we had a client. So in this, the client was ourselves, and characteristic of the early work that we did, like just starting, we were our own clients. So we pretty much were just working for other people and then doing work on our own to kind of start our practice without really knowing it was a practice. Fun Pissoir is a female urinal prototype, and this is a project that I worked on. The first drawings I did when I was working in an architecture office, working 80-hour weeks, and I'd come home and do this for fun, and just do the drawings. And it was instigated by this PISS manifesto, which I read in what was called a girl zine called Riot, Girl Frenzy. And when I read this, I couldn't believe it, and then I was like, well, what if? And then I just started thinking, what if, and what could an architect do to facilitate this? And approached it as a kind of architectural problem, and sort of playing off of things like specs for toilets and kind of making representations that were like, I guess this is something that's kind of happened in the work, like playing off of existing representations to make our own representations. So the issue with the urinal, well, there's the issue of standing for women, but then there's also the issue of privacy, and modesty is another issue. The main issue, I would say, is modesty. So these were some of the early drawings. Actually, the image on your right was from an installation where the drawings were all life-size. And basically, the object was modeled off of the body, which meant that for like my friends who were shorter, it didn't work for them, which they pointed out to me later. Anyway, so there's a kind of parallel investigation of theory and like theoretical underpinnings of like gender, and then just making an object. And a kind of fixation with hardware, which I think is very similar to the project that preceded it, Flip Flop. But here it's kind of a little more playful, I guess. These are two installations. One is in a bathroom where the bathroom is disabled, and actually women used it in that location. It was in an art fair in the Gramercy Hotel, and then the other was in my studio at the Whitney program. These are just the parts. The mirror was kind of fundamental in the question of identity. The lipstick was sort of a response to the reason that queues are so long is that women are always making up their faces.
Okay. This next project, this next project is actually sort of a continuation a few years later of some of the things we were doing in the Flip Flop project, looking to construct a domestic space really around a series of components using different types of technologies. And this was a prototype for the Field Museum in Chicago for a manufactured home that would be built using the technologies of library storage components, expandable chassis, and bellows, the kind of foldable bellows made out of conductive fabrics that's used actually now by the Defense Department. And so when the Field Museum asked us to, actually it was the City Design Center of Chicago and the Field Museum asked us to do this, we began to speculate on some, sort of post-war homes where trailers tried to be more like cars, and we began to think more of how today cars tend to be, minivans and such try to be more like homes, with the interjection of things like, you know, DVD players and so on. And so basically there's a little movie here which explains it. I think there's some sound actually. Yeah, so here we go. So anyways, the house itself arrives just like any other manufactured home where the chassis actually stays with the house, expands out. The two end pieces where it expands out are the kind of larger rooms, the living room on one hand and the master bed on the other. And then in between are these kind of series of components, like I said, that are attached to the chassis with a kind of courtyard in the middle. On the surface, there's solar panels that then go directly into the bellows, the expandable fabric. And the idea was that essentially you could begin to open a room and close a room, and then when you open the room, the bellows would expand, allow light in, and then when you closed the room, you would be able to then open up another room. The idea being that a family really only concentrates its activity just in a few parts of the house at one time. So this is the kitchen, which can be a bar kitchen or expand to a full kitchen. And this is San Francisco. That's it. But this idea of the domestic space really being focused more on components, and that leads to a kind of domestic protocols of using space, where you engage it, you activate it through activating the components themselves, became just a sort of point of interest, and then expanded into this recent project in Harlem, which is on the upper two floors of this Dutch Revival townhouse from, I guess, 1897. And we were, again, it was another long and skinny space, and we do a lot of projects in long and skinny spaces for some odd reason. And this had been a HUD ownership apartment from the 1980s that, when the terms of that ownership, after a while you can, if you're the owner, you can then sell that at market rate, which this owner did to another guy. And we basically took the very partitioned up space and took out all the walls and just moved everything to the walls, a little bit like Minimax in a series of components. Although this was had a slightly higher budget than that one did. It's a single man who really just didn't want anything at all in the space, and wanted a very high-end kitchen, but never used the kitchen, so didn't really care about its functionality. So we stacked $30,000 worth of appliances on one tower, and then created a continuous sort of counter that acted as the kitchen on one side and then bled into the living room on the other side. We also opened up the two floors and had this steel stair that, because of the small space of getting up through this townhouse, was actually welded on site and sort of is attached to a beam in the lower end with a clamp, and then attached to the wall on the right and one other spot. And then where we opened it up, we connected the two areas in the bridge, and then we sort of ripped out the ceiling on the top to expose the underside of the the kind of Dutch Revival, dormer. And then he also wanted a roof thing, so we did a roof thing as well. So this is the dining area, and just sort of, kind of replacing windows, not doing too much here, rather other than the finishes. And then, as I said, moving upstairs, this was sort of his lair. And he was kind of a great client where, the more we pushed everything as a series of components, it meant some things like showers had to get stuck in the bedroom. And so this is actually the shower that sits in the bedroom and looks out onto the garden. He's actually not that immodest a guy. And then, but the whole space can be then partitioned off if he does want some privacy. And the water comes out of the pipe just directly down. So, let me see. And then moving outside, this is the bed area under the awning. Like I said, the space is only about 14 feet wide. It's like a 16-foot wide townhouse with a skylight. And then, oh yeah, and he has a collection of 60 sneakers, and so you can see them sort of stacked up behind, framing his view out. There's a little bench step that takes you out at the top of the stairs out to the garden. And when you get out there, he's not there, but there are skylights that have been punctured down into the window that are sort of flush, and he has a Rottweiler that tends to hang out there. So the next set, Yolande will talk about the first of these, but is this notion of subject. And a lot of the work that we do tends to be for art institutions, especially Museum for African Art, Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Art. And there's this question in terms of how do you establish an identity, not necessarily for Africans, African Americans, but as much for the institutions that show African art or African American art. And then Yolanda's going to.
Right. So this is a small installation project. It was, you may have heard of it because Scott Ruff was one of the people who was invited to do one of the boxes for a city on the Southern Crescent train line. And our take on the project, we were given the city Philadelphia, and we looked at it as through the idea of the city of brotherly love. And like when we first went there, we were kind of doing research and we were looking at the Underground Railroad, and we were trying to figure out how to approach telling a story of Philadelphia, of its of like train travel for African Americans along this train line in Philadelphia. And we went and visited the Liberty Bell, and we were just kind of thinking a lot about the idea of the seat of the nation being formed in some ways in the city. And that led us to look at actually like the whole legal system of segregation, and as it relates to train travel, specifically public accommodations, and not just Philadelphia, but every city along the Southern Crescent line. And so we, in doing our research, we were looking at public accommodation laws, and we looked for each city and kind of mapped them in a matrix of more integrationary, less integrationary, or more segregationist, north, south. And the whole idea was to try to spatialize like the not to spatialize the laws. We kind of saw it that there was a legal topography and a spatial topography, and we were mapping the two together. And so our initial studies were just these representations, kind of some in awe of the train, some just trying to show the dynamics of public accommodation laws, which were kind of tricky. Sometimes laws were enacted, and then they were like new laws were passed that actually like undid them. And so that was part of what we were mapping in these diagrams. In the installation, we produced a card, the box, and the box itself maps a kind of abstracted graph of integration and segregation laws on its exterior. And then on its interior, a lot of the mapping that we did was kind of projected on the interior with the kind of timeline of north and south, and segregation and integration mapped within it. So you would spin the dial and play with the card catalog, and then there were plates for each city that you could also shift around. I think it goes, yeah. So this is an installation actually at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, which was last semester, where all of the boxes were installed there. The curator was William Williams, who teaches at the University of Virginia, and he basically invited 13 African-American architects each to do a box of a city. And one thing that all of the boxes had in common was that we were all trying to, we were dealing with things that weren't very physically tangible, and like in our case it was the law, and we were trying to make them physically tangible, and our approach was through a game.
Okay, so you talk about this one.
Yeah? Okay. Okay, this is the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Art. It's in Fort Greene in Brooklyn. And it's on the ground floor, and this was a building that was being renovated by...
Open Office.
Open Office.
They don't exist anymore.
Yeah. And so we were on the ground floor, kind of on the corner, and it's basically a gallery space, a very, very small office, and a reception area / store. One of the main wishes of the client was that there be a map of Africa in the front. We work a lot with maps of Africa because we work with the Museum for African Art, and every show has to have a map of Africa. And one of the things that we didn't want to do is just put a map of Africa there. So we basically made the whole space the map. It was important to us that you walk into the space of the map. And we did that by taking actually the map, but not its geography, by taking the time zones of the map, which are more like the, well, they're all political markers, but we took the time zones. It's a slightly abstracted version of the map, but you can also make out some of the geography if you look at it close enough. Yeah. And so we projected the identity of the museum on the outside in a light box, and then we kind of enlisted a friend who was a graphic designer, and so that's actually, the color bars are her design for that. And then on the inside, we got an artist to paint the lines for us within the reception area. This is a rendering for the inside of the galleries. The curator, the main curator, was coming from, they were coming from a townhouse where things were broken up into really small rooms. So she wasn't quite wedded to the idea of having an open space. She wanted flexibility, so we basically made small compartments that could open into a larger gallery. So you could have one larger gallery, one kind of medium-sized gallery, and a small gallery. You could do different things with it. And in the end, she was really pleased. One thing that most of our projects, even the Japanese ones, have in common is that they're all done on a very economical budget. So,
and also I think for
the pipe column,
institutions like this, it was public funding. You can get lots of money for capital funding to do the project, but then you don't get anything for operational funding. So to change a show is actually a big expense. And so that was part of the impetus behind that.
So this is showing some of the ideas behind the reception mapping. Basically, we were mapping the African diaspora, and the diaspora is spread all over the world. And that's actually how we got into the time zone idea. So it was this idea that we would locate the African diaspora. We did it in major cities, the military, using like military locations, but then also the Atlantic and sub-Saharan slave trade were part of the map. And then this is the time zones on the upper left-hand corner, flattened out, and then on the bottom left-hand corner, mapped in the space, and then on the right was the projection of it becoming from 2D into 3D as furniture. And then these are shots just of it inside. Yeah. And here you can kind of see a little bit into the gallery. The glass door lets you into the gallery. It's a really small, tight space. Kind kind of has a lot of energy. And these are just some of the cities and where you would find people from the African diaspora. And we just kind of put it like the dots are where the cities are, and wherever they fell was where they fell. And we worked on this. This was an interesting project where we actually started making things by hand again because of economy.
Yeah. This project we did a couple years ago. We were actually on a team, competition-winning team, as the interior architects with Bernard Schumi for a new building on the corner of 5th Avenue and 110th Street. And I'll go back. And we ended up winning the competition, or Bernard ended up winning the competition. But they needed to move from their old place in Soho out to Long Island City. That's how we ended up in Long Island City, at our office as well. And so they took this building. It was when all these temporary museums were opening up, the temporary MoMA. They did Todd Williams and Billy Chin did a temporary Noguchi museum on the second floor of this building, and then we did the one on the top. And it did bring in this question in terms of how do you make a museum for African art, or what does it portray about Africa in the space? And since we had this kind of open warehouse space and a budget of, I think, $20 a square foot to do it, of 13,000 square feet, there wasn't much to work with. So we decided that instead we would rather take on the kind of temporary aspect than the Africa aspect. But at the same time, I think through just the notion of actually defining a continent was an impossible task. So the space itself has actually ended up being this kind of very almost ad hoc, I guess, construction, mainly of layered plastic. So basically finding ad hoc materials and trying to bring out a kind of an emergent sense of color to at least begin to challenge the idea of what a neutral gallery space is. And then the gallery itself was just a series of cables. And with the cables themselves could then be reconfigured for each show through these different colored, I guess, fiberglass fabric walls. And so that's how shows were always sort of put up and taken down at a very low cost, very low budget. The idea was to not spend much on this space because they would need it for the building, which the building still hasn't begun construction almost 10 years later. And the architect has changed from Bernard Schumi to Robert Stern, and our role has changed a little bit as well, even though we're still involved with it. But as a result of this taking so long, that space kind of then closed down. And we've since done, I think, 14 exhibition designs for the museum at their various shows. And because they don't have a space, these shows are everywhere from the World Financial Center in New York City to Charleston, South Carolina. We just finished a show. This was on African architecture. This was actually a contemporary show in the Long Island City space. And then this was also in the Long Island City space, just one of the earlier shows on African materiality. But our whole association with them has engaged a lot of these questions about how you, basically just kind of that struggle between art in its own right and the contextualization of art and the impossibility of doing that within a museum context. And it's taken us to a current museum project, which we're in the design process of now, that's in Japan. And it's a funny little museum on a campus that is half for a precious collection of woodcuts, and the other half is for just like a messy student gallery in a 6,000 square foot space. And the project actually began, we'll show you a project a little bit later on of, let me just go back to this, and go back to that. It began as a renovation of these 3 floors in this kind of ugly 1970s library building, and the 2 orange floors in the lower right-hand corner were to be converted into a gallery, and the upper area a sort of presentation room. And so we were asked to do this interior renovation and make these offices into a gallery. And so we did, and but then, and which you can see in the upper left-hand corner are some some sketches of the scheme, which they ended up really liking, but and we were going to go ahead with it, but they the cost was quite a bit to retrofit this building. And then next door, there actually just happened to be this open site with a shed. And so 7 days before we were about to go there, Yolande said, oh, why don't we just ask them to tear down the shed and build a new building? And so we basically took that interior scheme and we made it into a building in a week and put it on that site. And they really liked it, but we didn't really like it very much. And so, but luckily the project was in order to sort of do this, and we had the 2 gallery floors that were on the lower levels in the building. We put them above, and the presentation hall, we put that below. So we sort of flipped it. That was the only kind of real major change that we made. But they really wanted a space where they didn't have to have a freight elevator to bring in stuff. And since we had everything up, to this level, everything would have to go through this elevator. So we then brought it back and we kind of redesigned it or retrofitted it basically as just a slanted building along a wide ramp that would be used both by visitors and by museum people to bring in stuff. And the building itself, it has these 2 truss walls. I'll just show it here. These 2 truss walls that are then kind of cantilevered over a space at a slant. And then underneath, again, is the presentation room. And then there's a series of openings that change, their performance sort of changes as you move around. So on the entry-level ramp, as you go up, they are sort of they're basically just glazed openings where this woman is going into. As they then fold over and are over the gallery, the sort of messy student gallery and the clean woodcut gallery are parallel to each other. Over the messy student gallery, they provide natural lighting, which is you can see there. And then you can see right next to that, as you're going in this direction, a solid long space, which is just basically a space for one very long table for the woodcuts, which is a completely dark space. And then above that, the perforations are being used to ventilate mechanical equipment that sits above that space. And then the ramp on the other side of the building where that guy is walking down, the perforations are just open to the sky. And then that takes you down to the presentation room, which is, again, on the lower floor underneath the cantilevered building. And so this project there's a funny story behind it, which I won't go into, but I think it's finally beginning to move forward. It's getting into the CD phase and then should go forward within the next year or so, depending on it all depends on a couple octogenarian farmers, but who actually own the land that's next to it. But I think their kids have finally convinced them to retire, and so I think we're finally pressing forward on this one. And then the last set of projects is under this kind of notion of circuit. And these are all projects to some degree where we tend to have this real interest, not necessarily in buildings or architecture, that the experience from the outside of it is perhaps more interesting than the experience from the inside. And anyways, Yolande will start with Project Row House.
Okay, so networked and circuits. Intimate Landscapes is a project that, again, it was an invitation. It was a curated piece. We were assigned a house, one of 8, and kind of not told to tell its story, but just to basically interact with the house. And what we started doing was research on row houses, well, the shotgun house in particular as a type, and we found its history as a vernacular type, and then as a type which had links to the Caribbean, and then also to Africa. And we ended up looking also at plantation history, and that was again through the readings that we did, looking at the type of the shotgun type. And one of the things that struck us in the readings was the way that African Americans came together even during slavery, like that there was an idea of a domestic space through the readings that we gathered, but it wasn't inside the house. It was actually often outside in the fields. And we started doing research looking at the texts, like texts of former slaves, trying to find domestic, like just clues about domestic space, yearnings about domesticity. And basically those things got mapped into the house. They got mapped on the walls. In addition, outside, there was this really beautiful kind of alley in the back where all of the people would kind of hang out, and it had dappled trees, and so the text and the dappled trees, you know, kind of were like projected into the house. And the whiteness of it, I don't know. Like we were very much into, well, we inherited a house that was very blank, and we were kind of into the idea of like whiteout and whiting things out, and basically just working with light and projections. We wanted to have a house of light, house of dark, and actually these images show really well the house of light, but the house of dark would only happen at night. Okay, I'll talk about this one. This is a project that we won. It was a competition that we won, and again, it was an invitation. This competition was sponsored by an African-American architect, Nathaniel Belcher, and a development organization, Little Haiti Development Organization in Miami, to make affordable housing for the Haitian community in an area. Little Haiti is kind of very close to the design district in Miami, which is where the Biennale is. And I guess the local community in some ways is being priced out. And part of what we were doing, when we went there, we had a whole kind of sensitivity training week where we met people in the community, and they really talked to us about like what was important to them and how to approach, what was their approach toward living. Like one of the things we found out was that for the Haitian community, it was really hard to sell them on the idea of like buying.
Yeah, or
no,
buying.
renting.
No,
Which
buying
was it?
apartments.
Buying apartments. So the idea of like a condo or a co-op was a really hard sell, because it was important to them that they have a piece of ground. Like the whole idea of ownership and also of subjectivity, identity was related to ground. So our approach was to give everyone a piece of ground, give everyone a front door and a back door, just trying to think of what makes a home, and how you could have an urban home and still have it work. So these are actually our competition boards. We thought it would just be nice to show the boards, and we had to satisfy a range of criteria, from LEEDs criteria. We thought about natural ventilation, so basically all of the apartments are designed so that they all breathe, in addition to having a central core. This will show you the pieces. The central core. The core was something that was critical, that we got as critical from the local people. in the Haitian community, there is a public space where children would be watched by a community rather than by a single person or a single family. And so we wanted to have a core. Actually, Les Mitans is heart or core in the complex. And then also the open spaces, you can kind of see how there are the open spaces that go through the units. They sometimes get internalized, but it's like a clear shot all the way through, so that if one were to open a door on one side and the other, the air could go through. And again, we were kind of playing off the shotgun type, where you have an opening in the front, an opening in the back, and you know, in the shotgun, it was the mythology of like shooting a shotgun and a bullet could pass all the way through, but it's actually a good way to aerate the house. And so each apartment has that kind of aspect. And then this is the core with the garden, bamboo inside, again, because we were thinking of it as being self-sustaining. And the competition, well, actually, we went into CDs, and it's been like 2 years. The CD set was done. We worked with a Miami architect to do the CD set. We had to make some revisions. Instead of being 3 high, it got 4 high. The front building had to have 2 levels of parking. Everything was actually really driven by parking. And instead of being 5 wide, it was 4 wide. So 4 wide and 4 high. And that was in this phase, and that's where the CD set is. And then the client, even though we were doing the CD set, the client went to the bank recently to get funding and wasn't able to get funding. And everybody knows, like, because of the recession, the market in Miami has been really badly hit. So now we're actually like approaching the project in a different way, like trying to think about funding in this economy. But there were changes that we've made here. Like this is showing the double height parking, and then nice things happened in this scheme actually, where we had the 4 high, 4 wide, and the double height parking, and it enabled us to open up the courtyard space onto a 2nd floor area. But we'll see what happens in the future with it.
Yeah. This is looking at a sort of analogous city or an analogous circuit through a city. It's a project we did a number of years ago for the Architectural League, and it was to spotlight 6 new pieces of architecture in the city, and which I think, as many of you know, showing architecture is actually a very difficult task because you're really showing a representation of something, and we thought it was odd that you would have this type of show within the city where the actual things do exist. So what we tried to do with this little exhibit was to make this kind of analogous city that organized the projects north to south, but then also kind of created a sort of uniform presentation system as a kind of signage system, that within each sign as well, there would be a kind of like map or direction to take you to the actual city. So the idea was that this little exhibition would be the first stop on a sort of journey through to see some of these projects. And this was, I think, 2000, maybe 1999. So the things being shown were like, you can see the Austrian Cultural Center over there by Raymond Abraham, at the Studio Museum where that Rogers Marvel did, amongst some others. And here you can see the sort of signpost that takes you to the actual site itself with little maps that would actually get you there. I mean, this project was one that sort of began to sort of open up our interests in terms of actually moving through cities and around architecture. And so in Japan, we ended up with a commission to do 2 little buildings at 2 ends of a university that themselves were connected by a very long circuit. And one was for cars and visitors at the side near the yellow road that says bypass, and the other that said student entrance was a little kiosk for students, an information kiosk. But both were buildings that you would pass rather than, or pass through. The visitor one was actually a drive-through building where you would kind of go pick up your little maps, and then on the top there was a cafe and museum, where you can see on the lower right-hand corner was the student one that students would pass by. And in order to kind of program these spaces, we basically juxtaposed in the lower right-hand corner the class schedule and the train schedule, and saw that there were usually gaps of waiting of either 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or 40 minutes. So we programmed a 10-minute space, which was a magazine stand, a vending machine, a 20-minute space, which was a magazine stand, a 40-minute space, which was a laptop counter. It's only like 1,000 square foot building with a little garden on the top that you can pass or get to through this little cut in the roof. And there you can see on the other hand the bypass building with the car drive-through. So we saw it more as like an X versus Y project. Again, buildings that you can sort of move through without going inside. And you can see that in between class ramp is actually an exterior ramp which takes you to the top. The project never got built, but the president of the university felt so bad that it didn't get built that another thing came up, and she asked us if we'd be interested in it. And she was on another campus. Her school of management was breaking off from the School of Economics and forming its own department. And there was an underused site on campus, and she thought, well, even though we don't necessarily need a building, maybe it would be good to have a building. People in Japan think this way, which is nice for architects, in order to kind of solidify an identity for this new business school. So this is the site. You can see that green thing. It was a very odd-shaped site with this actually very nice hillside, which you can see that blobby thing next to it is a hillside. And but because of the way that it is was occupied, and maybe we do it, skip forward, were these kind of old sheds. And you can see from this picture that that there was a height differential of about 2 meters. The upper shed is higher up than the lower shed, and this shot is being taken from the hillside. And then on the lower right-hand corner, or the lower image shows what the project was under construction. So we basically took away all that stuff and used this odd-shaped site. The other buildings on campus, which you can't really see in that aerial shot, are these really long double-loaded corridor classroom buildings. And we thought, well, it'd be really nice to have a single-loaded classroom. But in the upper corner, you can see that would be like a 600-foot-long building to get in everything that they needed. It's a 70,000 square foot building. So we basically took that single-loaded corridor and we wrapped it as a kind of snake, and we attached the head to the tail with what we call the kind of glass hairpin that holds everything in place. And so you can see on the lower left-hand corner the kind of snake with the glass hairpin tucking itself into the site. So basically that's what the project, what was our plan strategy was. But our sectional strategy was, for so long, since this hillside had been blocked off by these warehouse buildings, it would be nice to have a path that took you there, which was kind of antithetical to actually putting a building there, which would get in the way. So we thought, well, sectionally, while the building is turning in one way, we should have it kind of lift itself up in order to allow people to actually move underneath and through the building and up and around and up to the hillside. So that's what these diagrams are. The upper is the landscape strategy. Then the second diagram on the right is we basically put all the public things that be for the university as well as the school. 2 auditorium, one for 250, one for 400, a cafe, and a media space where you can see these elliptical cutouts. And then above that, we put these classroom blocks, which are modular lots. So there's basically 50 students per classroom door, or that's what each classroom can hold. So you can have a two-door classroom for 100, a three-door classroom for 150, and then you can refigure the interior walls depending on the institutional demands. So, anyway, so here's the building, and so you can see that kind of slab with this is the 400-person auditorium where it kind of rises up. It's the lower part of the site. We also ended up doing the landscaping as well, but we'll talk in this like courtyard here. It's actually bracketed by what's called the Women's College. In Japan, they still, sorry about this, in Japan they still have these kind of finishing schools for women, 2-year colleges. Which are finally getting phased out, thankfully. But so we saw this central courtyard as a kind of nice interaction area between the women's college and the business school. We thought it might yield some positive unions. And so you can see the lower part of the site is negotiated by the floor of the auditorium. It kind of wraps around, and then it comes down again on the higher part of the site with the smaller auditorium, which doesn't have to go down that far. And there are 2 entries. There's one at the corner, and then there's one where the auditorium comes down. So this is the one of the entries with, like I said, the modular classroom units above, and the doors kind of marking the measure of each classroom. So, as you move through the building, again, you can see that wooden stair, which is the path through the building without entering the building. So that path then takes you up to the upper floor. To the left is this sort of media center. On the image on the left, you're on the other side of the auditorium, which is actually kind of slightly disengaged from the rest of the building. Takes you up to the courtyard area, this is the second floor. You can see the stair, how it meets, and then these, they're 5-meter wide elliptical skylights. They bring light down into the media center below. And there's the glass hairpin bridge on this slide, and on the left is the kind of main stair core. So those 2 things face each other. Then in the media center, we actually designed this furniture to kind of follow the contour of the skylights. The business school, particular business school wanted a kind of more entrepreneurial culture, so we tried to kind of create a sort of like hotel lobby where actual deals get done in the media center. What ended up happening, though, was you can see in the lower left-hand corner that most students came to take naps there, which is a big part of Japanese student culture. And actually, students from 2 neighboring universities would actually come here to take naps as well. So the last time we were there, actually 2 of these have been taken out and replaced with very uncomfortable furniture. We're really sad about that. And anyway, so this is the media center, and then you can see the single loaded corridor classroom that we used very deep mullions to get a kind of baffled light, and the window panes themselves are only 80 centimeters wide in order to get that baffling. And then these perfectly aligned seats in the classrooms. And then this is from the bridge, from the glass hairpin. Again, there's a continuous circuit around, and none of this is conditioned space, and they're operable windows. So it actually creates a sort of air circuit around the outside of the building, and then each of the classrooms themselves are individually controlled. And then this is on the higher part of the site where, again, the slope comes down, and that's the smaller 250-person auditorium, and then the classrooms above that. The landscape strategy is something that actually pervades the entire building. The campus has this incredibly hard grain, but because of the hillside, our building kind of kinks from it. So we thought it might be interesting to play that kink against the very hard grain. So the landscape itself was to sort of play up that grain, but I don't know if you noticed in the other images, but that grain exists in the carpeting, it exists in the lighting grid, it exists all throughout the building. I don't really understand what the grid is, only Yolande really knows. But this is how it plays itself out in the courtyard with either these slits of grass, these benches, or these rectangular bushes. And then this is now moving out from that courtyard as you're moving towards the hillside. There's this small cafe that where the building slants. You move across that cafe and then over a bridge back onto the hillside. And so this is from the hillside. And when we were doing our initial images, we projected a film there, which is actually Ozu's Tokyo story from I guess early 1960 or so. But when they had the building opening, they played the Japanese classic Sound of Music instead. So I think that wraps it up. Yeah. So anyways, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for showing the work. You know, it's interesting. I'm not sure if this is on.
Yeah.
But it's great to see the work and the range and scale, and it's also work that's done in academic settings. Some of it's self-generated. Some of it's funded through standard market forces. Other projects, many of the projects are also publicly funded through arts organizations. Can you talk about the way you think about strategizing this as an architect in terms of getting work built?
Let's see. That's an interesting question. It's a question that we actually ask ourselves now. Because in many ways, our approach has just been, if someone asks us to do something, we say yes. And so we haven't actually been pounding the pavement, trying to get the work, but we have realized, in the process of working, there are certain types of work that we do, certain areas that we work within, and we do in a way, kind of with a lot of the installation projects, we're, I suppose, constantly applying for grants or fellowships so that we can do more research-oriented type projects, or we're working with arts institutions to do either exhibits or their interiors, or we're working with an educational institution, the university in Japan, to try to do more university buildings. And most recently, the recent addition has been residential, where we've just started to do, with the apartment that was shown in Harlem, we've started to do residential work. And it's a bunch of different hats that we wear, and the questions in some parts of what we do are not relevant in other parts. But sometimes there's feedback or feed-through. So for instance, in the box project, de facto du jour, the kind of geometry that it had actually was a sort of fallout from studies that we did when we were looking at Mokata, when we were trying to figure out how to represent the time zones. One of the studies was projecting the time zones out, and then that actually kind of found its way into the representation of de facto du jour. I think I kind of took your question somewhere else, but one of the things that I think characterizes the practice is our inability to characterize the practice. because we're doing these different things. But then what's interesting for us is when they start to feed each other.
I also think, I mean, we have, it's probably not the best habit, but we do tend to get very, especially with the public clients, very involved with them in that and I think we use that to sort of help our case. So for instance, with the Museum for African Art stuff, we really get involved with their shows. We sort of educate ourselves about African art, so then we can kind of connect to them at their level, and there's almost this kind of reciprocity of them connecting with us on our level. And the Japanese work too, where we teach at the school and they have a relationship and are become almost embedded with the institution, so that they see us not necessarily as someone they're hiring or something that they have to battle with for ideas, but they see us as kind of part of them, and so that we're kind of making an institutional contribution from within. Like the Museum for African Art, they literally do treat us in the worst ways sometimes as family. But it does take, I think, a certain situation where, because we teach, we're able to sort of feed ourselves from that institution, and probably we are able to kind of involve ourselves in ways that perhaps other architects don't have the luxury to.
Okay, so you were recently written up in the New York Times for a loft project that you did in New York City. It was like, what, a couple weeks ago?
Oh, that one, yeah.
Yeah, it was this one. So I was wondering, jumping from different scales of economy and also different scales of the projects, going from like the loft project in New York City that cost $500,000 with a person who kind of had the money to retrofit or to renovate, to the Little Haiti project, where it's a publicly funded project with many different clients. How do you kind of gauge your practice jumping between the two scales and the two different, I guess, client types?
Oh, well, the interesting thing about the Harlem Loft is that that was a low-budget project. Even though it's kind of like a high price, the client was nickel and diming us all the time, and we were like nickel and diming each other. And so we actually were milking it for as much as we could, even though the budget was higher. One of the things that was really interesting in that project, because it was our first residential project, was just like how little is actually spent on architecture. So in that project, the AV, because it has this whole kind of, I guess like in this auditorium where things kind of, shut on and shut off with a push of a button or whatever, and kind of like in the movies, that was much more expensive than the architecture. And that was kind of the client's main priority. Like, he came to us with already a chunk of the budget being spent for that. And so then the architecture that's why the architecture had to be, we had to scrimp and save with it. But flipping from like one scale to the other, I don't know, we're just constantly doing it. It's something we're always doing, where, for instance, Mokata happened at the same time as Josai. In the same amount of time, 2 years. Each project took 2 years. The office was working on both of them. And yeah, Mokata was city funded. And in Mokata, we were working mostly with the client, who was the founder of Mokata, Lori Kumbo. And so in a sense, working with her wasn't really that different for us than in the apartment working with that client, because we had a one-to-one relationship with a person, and it was very much about the person's dreams. In one case, it was the dreams of an institution, and in the other, it was the dreams of a home. And then with Josai, the business school, there was a committee of faculty members, and we worked a lot with the faculty members. And again, it was like individual people with pet projects and desires for the university, and we just worked directly with them. And so in some ways, it didn't feel that different from one project to the other. And all of them had tight budgets, even though, as you can see, there's a really big range in what something with a tight budget actually is. And I'd say the same thing for the Little Haiti project as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, when you are working with these kind of institutional clients, or like the developer at Little Haiti, how, like what Yolande says, how personal it becomes very quickly. And so, that Mokata was, we really felt like we were almost like designing our house, even though it was a museum, and the mentality wasn't really that different. And the kind of budget questions were, I think they're always there. It's more this kind of like layers of, maybe sort of layers of permission that you have to go through. But it's, I don't know, I don't really feel that there's too much of a distinction. And that client too, I don't know, did you see the little slideshow video of it? Yeah. And he's like kind of a character, and he has his own sort of deal with Harlem, and it's but is this kind of like passionate about the place as he is about his space. And so in that way too, it was a kind of connection to some of these other projects, that it wasn't really about just kind of making something a commodity for oneself, but actually be engaging oneself in a larger urban context.
I don't know if we still have time, or yes? I was wondering, with your hands-on approach on some of your earlier installation work, and you're very interested in, just getting dirty and touching the material, and how does that necessarily translate? So it's almost like this parallel question to the economic question I was just asked, the scale question, but this one starts to engage the craft of the work. And how is it that you are able to translate the hands-on approach and the intimacy with the architecture and the materiality itself, and then in the more public projects, larger projects, work with contractors and site visits itself, and how much relationship?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's a question that I think when we lecture, we're asked that almost every lecture, I think. And it's something that we sort of think about and struggle a lot with as well. But it did, of course, there's a certain amount of removal that occurs with scale, and with working with contractors or construction managers, and all these different layers. But I think the initial work, and there's still work that we do where we actually do, it is more hands-on, relative to the scale. But I think it did, there was a kind of progression that still exists, where we probably, not where we always should, but we do often then feel comfortable sort of circumventing those layers to get to the person who's most immediately connected with the thing itself. So by that I mean, by beginning by doing the welding and stuff for the initial flip-flop stuff, getting a sense of metal work, and then the sort of installation stuff, working directly with craftspeople and being able to communicate and feeling comfortable with communicating with them was the sort of next step. Then going to the next step, where then you start working with contractors, other things. We have a tendency to spend more of our time with the subs than we do with the contractors. So, the stair in that apartment was done very directly with the metal worker, even though it was a metal worker the contractor brought in. Then going to Japan, and which is even another layer of separation. Again, kind of getting a strong relationship with the foreman on the site, and the kind of concrete for that building. We did there were 4 different types of formwork we designed. Then each formwork, the guy did, I think, 6 different types of mixtures, made this sort of actually installation art of just 1.5 meter by 1.5 meter square slabs, about 16 of them in a field for us to look at. Again, kind of going directly to, or just feeling, I mean, we tend to do that. We tend to kind of go directly to the fabricators.
With these slabs, what Sunil's talking about was we had to pick which
Looked best.
which one we thought looked best, what we wanted to be the finish for the building, and so you know, the approach there is I think, well, we were very lucky in Japan because it is a kind of craft-oriented culture. It's very detail-oriented. So they would have 16 examples of a concrete pour, you know, for us to choose from, and you know, we were kind of like a bit like, not taken aback, but we were like, you know, sort of wowed by the fact that they would even, you know, do that, or that they would care, you know, because it seemed like it was such great attention to detail. But that happened all along in the building in Japan, where even though there's a larger, like in New York, we tend to work more directly with the subs, but in Japan it's a larger organization, but still you're kind of pulled into the process, and you're part of the detail, you know, the making of the details, and you kind of are on site inspecting things, and so it's a luxury, I guess, to have that kind of client, but it kind of is very synthetic.
It's interesting. I mean, I think there's maybe not to sort of our peers, architects of our age, especially in New York at that time, and I guess maybe it happens with every age of architect, but you know, there are a lot of us who were doing these, entered into things, maybe teaching on one hand, but then doing like exhibitions and things and so on. And I think it's, for a lot of us, not just us, but some of our peers too, it's that kind of sensibility. Of course, as the scale gets greater, it's harder to be more connected, but I do think that even the things that you guys do here in terms of fabrication and stuff, just to get a sort of sense of that, it gives you this other level of understanding where then you can kind of peel back the institutional layers of building, of practice, and be able to, you know, collaborate with people who you probably shouldn't even be talking to, but with productive results, I think. So.
I would like to thank our guest, Studio SUMO, for coming to Syracuse and sharing their lovely presentation and their projects with us. I would also like to thank Dean Robbins, John Yoder, our advisor, Scott Ruff, our co-sponsors, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, and of course, my e-board. Also, we would like to remind you guys, we have our transition symposium tomorrow, 12:30 in the auditorium. We have 2 panels. We also have an honors and recognitions portion in which we're honoring one of our retired professors, Kermit J. Lee Jr., and one of our alumni, Brian West, who passed away recently. Come out and support, and thank you all for coming.